Radio allowed us to be able to communicate, to be able to share our views on what was going on, and to also bring in other perspectives that we might not have been privy to had we not had this radio that was able to reach so many other people. I was on the air at the age of 16, very young age to be on. And to make sure that those who are listening get it in context, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, I was 14 years old. And a lot of people, young people, were very, very angry over his assassination. And Morris Blum, who owned radio station WANN, did something that helped to avert a catastrophe in the city of Annapolis. He had young people, myself included, come to the radio station and to discuss and to ventilate our concerns, and allowed us to do it live for more than an hour. So we were able to talk about the various grievances that we had during that time. So 2 years later, he thought it'd be a great idea to have what it was called Community Viewpoint, a program that would allow me as moderator to be able to bring people in and to interview. And it started off as a 15-minute program that would be aired on Tuesdays at a time slot. And it went so well because what he had thought was initially that the kind of people I would be interviewing would be mostly local people in Annapolis and kids of my age. What it turned out to be was I interviewed people like Ralph Nader, Jack Anderson, Dick Gregory, Jesse Jackson, Stokely Carmichael, and even the head of the Ku Klux Klan, which was an interesting interview itself. Yeah. And bringing these national figures enable us to broaden the discussion. So people started tuning in. To have a James Baldwin bring his particular perspective to what's going on in the world served as an incentive for people to pick up James Baldwin's book, or to have a Dick Gregory come and talk about fasting and nonviolence and why this is important. The key was just to allow them to talk. One of the interviews I most appreciated was the interview I did with James Baldwin. Experience I'll never forget, but having the opportunity to interview James Baldwin, to be able to talk about various issues of that day was an incredibly wonderful experience. Let's say it enhanced my stature incredibly. The question that all of many of the adults wanted to know is, how did you get Jesse Jackson or Congressman Perrin Mitchell, who was the first African-American congressman from the state of Maryland, and so many others? And the answer to the question was just asking. And I think in part it had to do with, I was so young at the time that it made it difficult for someone to say no to a kid. One of the things that happened to me as part of this radio career was because I was bringing on people who were very famous at the time. They readily gave me interviews, and I'm so grateful for it because I learned so much just through them. These were men and women who were not eyewitnesses to history. They were history makers. Interesting enough, it's similar to what it is today. It was police brutality. It was educational disparities. It was lack of affordable housing. Certainly job opportunities were part of the discussions at that time. So the radio discussion would often get into these philosophical debates, and voices like Cynthia Carter was put on the air. Because remember, prior to this, the only voices you heard came from white elected officials, white police officers, white chief of police. That's the way it was. And then by having this radio program, it allowed, and the owner of the radio station was a man named Morris Blum, who happened to be Jewish. And he really worked hard to create diversity. He wanted voices on there that would not normally be heard. And it turned out to not only be a good thing, but it also turned out to be a great marketing strategy, because you could turn to Baltimore stations, you could turn to Washington, D.C. stations, but you couldn't get Annapolis news or Annapolis issues.
Right.
By focusing on local issues, it built up a radio market. People tune into the radio station because they had an opportunity to hear one of their own, or they had an opportunity to hear issues that they were concerned about. It gave people perspectives that they had not previously heard before. And remember, it also opened up the vision and the perspective of others. And, you know, the more famous people were, you know, whites who had contributed in their own way. And I tell you, we interviewed the Ku Klux Klan, who turned out to be quite a character, to say the least. But those were the kind of things that radio enabled us to do, to reach audiences that we normally would not have reached. And the local radio station, WNN, played a pivotal role. The way the radio station worked, they used to have what they call a down-home ad. Down-home ad was mostly like a kind of religious programming, that they had a certain hour. Then they had what they call jazz, which again, depending on an audience, certain people like that genre, jazz. And then they had R&B, which was a top, because there was a time that only certain radio stations played R&B, gospel music, and WNN was one of them. And so the radio station also were able to get people like James Brown, who was at that time one of the top superstar entertainers, to be interviewed on the air. Cars Beach, which is located here in Annapolis, was a major draw for people. And so a lot of the entertainers passed through would use the radio station to promote whatever tour they were on. Hoppy Adams was considered a legend. His famous mantra was "Tonight, tonight, tonight," whenever he was advertising. And he would advertise events that were taking place in various parts of the state of Maryland. So little towns like Hurlock and Secretary and Berlin. I would later learn where these places were by physically going there. But way before I went there, I used to hear Hoppy talk about these locations that he was going to. And Mr. Blum was he was a philanthropist in the truest sense of the word, and he had a vision. So Mr. Blum actually found a niche that had been marginalized and underserved. And he actually made a very handsome profit by focusing in on the community and providing these services. Entertainment and information, the two, it served that purpose very well.